Hi guys, today we will start with the story, The Strangest Diseases of Medieval England. The Black Death, England, 1348. It was the year when death came, not as war or rebellion, but as a black stench, a drying wind and rotting sores. From the south, through the port of Melcombe Regis, a guest from the east arrived on English soil, the plague. It came without warning, but quickly made its dominion known. At first, the rats disappeared. Then dead children were found with dark spots beneath their arms. Then, the doctors vanished. And after them, entire streets, homes, and villages. People died within days. It began with fever and headaches, followed by swollen, painful buboes in the groin, neck, and armpits. From these swelled sacs oozed a foul, tar-like pus. Skin blackened, death marked the body before the soul departed. The rot began before the final breath. Women moaned in their beds, losing husbands and children. Men fled to forests, hoping to escape, as if the plague were a living thing that hunted them. But death found them there too. Churches overflowed with corpses. Bells rang constantly, not for celebrations or mass, but to announce fresh dead. Heaps of bodies, the stench of decay, and the cries of the dying overwhelmed even the silence of the grave. There were not enough coffins, nor enough burial land. Mass graves were dug, deep pits where the dead were thrown like carcasses. Monks who buried the bodies were soon buried themselves by others. Physicians offered little: charms, smoke, prayers. Some tried bloodletting and died faster. Others drank mercury. Some rubbed their skin with vinegar and garlic. Some boarded up their homes. No one was spared. England was divided between those already dead and those waiting to die. Parents abandoned children. Children left their parents to die alone. Priests died with crucifixes in their hands. The very soil seemed infected. The moon turned red. The air thickened, as though poisoned. Merchants stopped traveling between towns. Crops went unharvested. Mills stood still. Peasants became knights, for their lords had rotted in their graves. Church power crumbled, for relics could not protect. Monarchies withered. Death made no distinction between king and laborer. One by one, London, York, Oxford, Norwich, all fell. By spring of 1349, a third of England's people were gone. So many died that it seemed the devil himself had walked the land. When the plague finally receded, it left behind silent villages, shuttered homes, and hills swollen with corpses. The wind scattered coffin shards down empty roads. Only the crows, now well fed, seemed unaffected. Humanity stood at the edge of extinction and knew it. But worse than death was the knowledge that it might return. No one knew why it came, and no one knew how to stop it. The Dancing Plague, England, late 14th, early 15th century. Among fog-covered villages and dew-drenched meadows, a madness would sometimes ignite, not one of blood, blisters, or fever, but of dance. A strange, terrifying affliction, later called the Dancing Plague, would erupt like fire and consume entire settlements, leaving behind only emaciated bodies, brittle bones, and silent horror in the eyes of witnesses. It always began with one person. A peasant, a baker, even a monk might suddenly rise from a bench or field and begin to move. There was no music, no voice, no reason, only relentless, furious dancing. Movements were wild, grotesque, arms flailing like a puppet on broken strings. Sometimes the dance was oddly graceful, as if led by some unseen melody. More often it was agony, a struggle with invisible chains. Soon others would join. Watching, they felt their own legs pull them toward madness. Children, women, old men, all swept up as if possessed by a dark will. Crowds of dozens, sometimes hundreds, moved in chaotic waves, kicking up dust, knocking over stalls, trampling livestock, crashing through fences, They danced through day and night, without pause, without food, without sleep. Lips cracked from thirst, blood streamed from torn feet, hearts gave out. Some laughed as if drunk on delirium. Others screamed as if each step brought pain. It was not rare for someone to hurl themselves against a wall or into a river just to make it stop. But most collapsed from exhaustion and died. Their faces twisted in the final rhythm. People said it was a punishment, that God sent it for pride, gluttony, impure thoughts. Priests tried to calm the afflicted with prayer, sprinkling holy water, but often fell into the dance themselves. Some blamed witches, weaving spells into the very air. Others whispered it was the black magic of wandering minstrels, whose cursed music only the doomed could hear. Some towns hired musicians, hoping that giving the chaos a rhythm might ease it or bring it to an end. Sometimes this seemed to help. The dancing took on form, slowed, and some people danced out the sickness. But more often, the music only fed the madness. The dancers moved faster, shrieked louder, fell harder. No one was spared, rich or poor. One chronicle tells of 10 monks in a Yorkshire monastery who, during evening prayer, suddenly rose and began to dance around the refectory. Their bodies slammed into stone walls, knocking over candles, wine, and dishes. One died of suffocation, another from a burst heart. The rest were bound with ropes. Yet even then, their limbs twitched to a beat no one else could hear. Physicians were helpless. They tried bloodletting, leeches, and valerian tinctures, but nothing worked. For this was not an illness of the flesh, it was of the soul. The body became a puppet of something other. Some called it the devil's dance. They believed a demon entered through the soles of the feet and, upon reaching the heart, commanded it to dance to death. Others thought it was caused by the unburied dead, spirits seeking to return through the living. In some villages, all the adults died dancing, leaving only orphaned children behind. In others, terrified locals fled their homes, abandoning everything. The dancers were locked in barns, where they tore themselves against the walls, or they were chased into the wilderness, so the plague wouldn't spread. No definitive explanation has survived. Modern scholars suggest a link to poisonous ergot fungi, causing convulsions and hallucinations, but to the people of the time, it was something darker, a curse. It gripped the will, the body, the soul, and when the body fell, death was a mercy. The dancing plague remained in folklore as a symbol of chaos, a warning that even music can carry madness. Even a century later, people still whispered, "Don't dance at dusk on the open road, lest you hear that music." St. Anthony's Fire, ergotism. England, 13th to 15th centuries. When rye filled the fields and the harvest was good, people rejoiced. Grain meant bread, and bread meant life. But sometimes the earth gave poison instead of food, and the poisoning did not begin with screams. It began with burning, a slow, unbearable burning, as if the flesh itself had caught fire from within. So came St. Anthony's Fire, a terrifying and mysterious affliction that priests called a divine warning, and the common folk saw as a punishment worse than death. It always started innocently, a piece of bread made from rye flour. It might taste slightly bitter, but in times of hunger, no one complained. Only later would they learn that the grain was tainted with ergot, a toxic fungus invisible to the eye. It hid inside the kernels like the devil in confession, waiting for someone to take a bite. The first symptoms were deceptively mild, tingling in the fingers, numbness in the limbs. Then came the burning, intense, searing, as if molten copper flowed through the veins. People screamed that their hands were on fire, their feet ablaze like iron pokers in a forge. It was said that St. Anthony, whose name the disease would take, sent the fire to purify sinful souls. The skin blackened, cracked, and peeled. Limbs rotted and fell off like dead branches. Sometimes surgeons tried amputations, but rarely with success. The internal fire had already claimed the body. Those who didn't die from gangrene often slipped into madness. They saw demons, heard voices. Reality shimmered like heat on a summer road. People wandered the fields like pilgrims without direction, eyes wide with horror. Children suffered most. Their smaller bodies ignited from within much faster. Infants died screaming in their beds, backs arched as if an invisible hand pressed them against a hot skillet. Mothers cried out, "The devil is taking my baby!" And village healers would go door to door, marking crosses above thresholds and chanting prayers to ward off the fire. In some towns, the outbreaks were so severe that priests declared days of silence. For weeks, no one spoke aloud, afraid to utter cursed words that might awaken the holy flame again. Even the church bells fell silent. Only the rustle of straw in the wind and the quiet crack of scorched bones could be heard in the dawn. Monasteries built refuges far from towns to care for the afflicted, but often the monks themselves became sick. They called it a trial of faith and lay down to die with whispered prayers. Those who survived were usually disfigured, missing fingers covered in scars, hands that trembled without end. They were called fire witnesses, walking reminders of divine punishment. St. Anthony's fire did not discriminate. Peasants and nobles alike burned. In one story from Lincolnshire, the son of a local lord died, not in flames, but from eating bread tainted with mold. His mother blamed a local witch and had her burned, but the disease only spread wider. In fear, entire villages turned on their elderly and midwives, seeking someone to blame. Superstitions multiplied. People believed bread that cast no shadow under moonlight was cursed. Bakers examined their flour by lamplight, terrified that a single dark grain could harbor the demon. Some believed that if you ate without prayer, the fungus would find you. And yet, despite the terror, there was a strange holiness to it. Some believed that surviving the burning made a person closer to God. They had passed through earthly hell and emerged purified. Their prayers were thought powerful, their blood even healing. Some paid gold for a single drop, but more often they were avoided, like lepers. In medieval England, this was one of the most feared and mysterious diseases. A sickness where bread, the symbol of life, became a weapon of death, a poison born from the very land. And like so many plagues of the time, the people did not seek causes. They sought someone to punish. Witches, sinners, harlots. But the truth was simpler and far more terrifying. They ate fire, and they burned from within. The Angel's Illness, England, 14th to 15th centuries. Among the many mysterious and terrifying afflictions that haunted medieval England, one stood apart for its cruelty, a disease that struck the most innocent, newborns. This strange sickness was called by many names: heaven's gift, soul fever, but most commonly, the angel's illness. When it arrived, adults fell silent, and mothers hid their babies in fear. It did not begin with pain. It whispered death through fever and light. It all started with a blush. Infants, who appeared healthy and strong, would suddenly begin to glow from within. Their skin would flush pink, then grow hot to the touch, as if fire had awakened beneath their delicate skin. Mothers would say, "He shines like an angel," and rejoice, believing it a divine sign. But joy quickly turned to dread. Within a day or two, the child would begin to breathe heavily. A haze would cloud their eyes, and their skin would bloom with spots, red as blood, purple as bruises. The fever rose so high that the air around their bodies seemed to shimmer, The infant would no longer cry, but moan softly, as if the soul was already preparing to depart. People whispered, "The angels have come for him," ready to carry him back to the heavens, unwilling to let him remain in a sinful world. In villages and towns, rumors spread. Some children are not meant for this world and should not be held back. It was believed that if a child began to glow from within, they must not be treated. People were to pray, not intervene, and leave the soul's fate in God's hands. Those who tried to help, cooling the baby with damp cloths, giving herbal brews, often only hastened death. Such efforts, they said, angered heaven. Some mothers went mad. They watched as their child became a burning vessel, a tiny body no earthly remedy could cool. In fevered delirium, women whispered that angels had placed a flame in their baby's chest, so the soul would burn clean before rising. One monastery chronicled a mother who, unable to bear her child's suffering, carried him to the altar and left him on the stone, saying, "Take him if you want him. I no longer hold him back." Sometimes the illness came in waves, claiming several babies in a village at once, homes filled with the strange scent of heat and honey, an aroma that, according to those present, surrounded children close to death. Elders claimed it was the scent of heaven itself, and that the children's souls were already halfway home. Priests could not explain it. Some called it a miracle, others a curse. Most disturbing was that adults were never affected. Only infants, usually under 3 months old, suffered from this glowing fever. In churches, special prayers were created to protect innocent souls. And in some parts of England, baptism rituals were moved to the first night after birth, so a soul could be saved before the body failed. Healers, not understanding the cause, blamed demons, night air, or the stars. Some mothers burned cribs where children had died, believing them cursed. Others buried the little bodies not in consecrated ground, but in groves and forest hollows, hoping the soul would join nature, not wander the other world in torment. Women who had lost a child to the angel's illness often refused to bear more. They were called touched, as if heaven's hand had marked them. People feared them, avoided their gaze, and in some villages they were cast out entirely. The angel's illness vanished as suddenly as it came. Sometimes no child would glow for a year. Other times 10 would die in a week. No one could predict it. No one knew a cure. Only one image remained in the minds of those left behind. The radiance that lit a baby's body before death, as if the soul itself caught fire to be seen by the sky. It was not just a disease. It was a phenomenon that lingered in folklore, in old women's tales, and in monastery ledgers. People believed if a baby begins to shine, he no longer belongs to this world. The angels are coming, and not even a mother can stop them. St. Vitus's disease. Medieval England, 14th to 16th centuries. In medieval England, fear didn't always arrive in the form of plague or boils. Sometimes it crept in as an invisible spark of madness, turning people into puppets of their own bodies. St. Vitus's disease, as it came to be known, was a terrifying and mysterious affliction that seized the body and twisted the soul. The afflicted would twitch, writhe, and wear grotesque facial expressions, as if demons were pulling at their muscles from within. The disease most often struck teenagers and young women. It began innocently, a tremble in the fingers, a flicker of the eyelids, a faint shaking in the legs. Villagers laughed at first. "She dances in her sleep," they'd say. But the laughter soon turned to horror. Victims began to move without will, their limbs flailing, their torsos twisting unnaturally, as though tangled in unseen strings pulled by something not of this world. At night, they would rise from their beds to dance alone, as if they heard music that no one else could hear. The movements were wild and frantic. They struck themselves, tore their clothes, screamed at invisible figures, laughed, and wept without warning. Some ran out into the rain and danced until they collapsed, unconscious in the mud. Their hands clawed at the air, as if trying to escape their own bodies. Local priests declared this was no illness. This was punishment, a sign of sin, or worse, possession by the unholy. As the affliction worsened, visions began. The afflicted spoke of horrors, black-faced spirits, burning monasteries, dead infants crawling through graves. Many said they heard drums, violins, bells, music no one else could hear. Victims were chained or locked in barns until their strength faded. Some danced until their feet bled and their muscles tore. A few danced to death. The disease was most common in summer, when the sun hung heavy in the sky and the air itself seemed thick with unseen forces. In some villages, entire groups of youths would suddenly be seized at once, dancing uncontrollably. Those places were declared cursed. Their bodies were later found in woods, contorted, bruised, their faces twisted in unnatural grins. Some believed only a pilgrimage could save the afflicted. Families dragged children and wives to monasteries dedicated to Saint Vitus, patron of dancers, epileptics, and those tormented by involuntary movements. It was said that if a sufferer touched the saint's relics, the dancing spirit would leave them. But most arrived already dying. Even monks feared to touch them. The dancing sickness, they said, could leap through skin contact. Medieval healers had no answers. Some blamed bad blood, others claimed it was the work of witches or cursed winds. Treatments included bloodletting, burning herbs under the tongue, and applying leeches to the eyelids. Most died in agony. Their bodies were hauled away like plague victims. Their bedding and clothing were burned. The houses they lived in were sometimes abandoned altogether. In some chronicles, monks themselves were seized by fits of motion. Their convulsions began with whispered prayers, but soon turned into frenzied thrashing. One scribe wrote, "Brother Edmund spun like a leaf in storm winds, collapsed in a foam, his eyes rolled white." These episodes were called silent possessions and became feared signs of judgment or the end times. Folklore grew. It was said that if a village bore 7 children of the same sex in a row, one would surely become a dancer. Newborns were marked with protections, rusty sickles above their cradles, garlic on the windows, and crosses made from bird bones. Villagers believed that without these precautions, the dancing spirit would enter the child as soon as it learned to walk. Even lepers were not as feared as the dancers. They were believed to carry madness. If someone convulsed in church, they were dragged out like a possessed person. Priests performed exorcisms, drenched them in holy water, read psalms over their writhing bodies. But no ritual could stop the dance. Death was not always swift. Some sufferers danced for weeks, unable to sleep, unable to eat. Their bodies shriveled, their joints dislocated, their feet bled. Those who survived were often left broken, mindless, vacant, trembling even in rest. People called them living puppets, played by something no one could see. Today, we know that St. Vitus's dance is a form of chorea, a neurological disorder sometimes caused by infection, genetic illness, or autoimmune conditions. But in the dark centuries of superstition and terror, it was more than a disease. It was a curse, a warning, a haunting presence. A dance of death that entered uninvited and never left the same way. The sweating sickness, English sweat. England, late 15th, mid-16th century. If the Black Death was a hammer, then sweating sickness was a dagger, swift, silent, and fatal. Known in England as the sweat, or simply the sudden death, it descended without warning, killed with terrifying speed, and vanished just as mysteriously. Unlike the plagues that festered in sores or the slow rot of fevers, the sweat struck like a shadow slipping into the lungs. Death came not over days, but in mere hours. Its first appearance came in 1485, the very year Henry Tudor landed in Wales and claimed victory at Bosworth to become king. And with the new king, it seemed, came a new curse. Whispers spread. The crown was bought not with gold, but with blood and sweat. In London, people began collapsing in their homes, in the markets, even at church altars. Soaked in sweat, gasping for breath, their skin pale and glistening with death's dew. The disease began innocuously, a sudden chill, shivering that gripped the spine. Then came the heat, an unbearable fever, heart pounding like a drum of war, a flood of sweat pouring from every pore. Within minutes, clothes clung to the skin like a wet shroud. Then nausea, pain, breathlessness. Often, the victim would sit down to rest and never rise again. It was not just the symptoms that terrified. It was the relentless speed. From the first shiver to death could pass as little as 3 hours. Some never made it past the first hour. Physicians were often too late. Priests arrived only to find cooling corpses. One chronicler wrote, "The sweat comes like a thief and leaves nothing but a body." What made it worse was that the sweat did not discriminate. Rich and poor, noble and peasant, priest and merchant, all were equally vulnerable. Kings and courtiers perished alongside bakers and sailors. The sick rooms became morgues overnight. Whole families were found dead by morning, slumped together in silence, their faces still glistening with damp and terror. The disease struck in waves, first in 1485, then again in 1508, 1517, 1528, and 1551. In between, it seemed to vanish entirely. People prayed it was gone for good, but always it returned. These outbreaks often began in summer and spread rapidly through towns and villages, as if carried by heat and breath. Entire cities grew still, holding their breath. Even more chilling, the sweat seemed to target only the English. During the massive outbreak of 1528, it spread across England like wildfire, but stopped abruptly at Calais, refusing to cross into France. Foreigners rarely caught it. German merchants, Italian monks, and Dutch sailors walked unscathed among English corpses. This peculiarity sparked fear and superstition. Some said it was God's wrath upon the realm. Others believed the Tudors had awakened an ancient curse buried in the soil of England. Medical science of the time had no answers. Some physicians blamed miasmas, foul airs from marshes or cesspits. Others looked to the stars, claiming the disease rose with certain planetary alignments. Treatments were desperate and largely ineffective, wrapping the patient in blankets, forcing them to drink spiced wine, applying leeches, or dousing the body with vinegar and herbs. But more often than not, the afflicted died before any remedy could be tried. People began to fear sleep itself. Many victims died quietly in the night, their hearts failing as they drenched their beds in sweat. Mothers doused their children in cold water to keep them awake, fearing that sleep would be their deathbed. Some even tied themselves upright to stay conscious. Death had no roar with the sweat, only a whisper, a breath, a silent fading into stillness. Houses struck by the disease were locked and marked. Inside, the air hung thick and wet, stinking of sickness and fear. The dead were wrapped hastily, buried without ceremony. Churches emptied, marketplaces fell silent. When the death bell tolled, it tolled without pause. By 1551, after its fifth major outbreak, the sweat vanished, without warning, without trace. It never returned. Even today, its true nature remains a mystery. Some historians believe it was a form of hantavirus. Others suspect an early mutated strain of influenza or hemorrhagic fever. Whatever it was, it left no clear evidence. Only the fear remained. the legacy of a disease that came like a storm, drowned its victims in their own sweat, and disappeared before the world could understand what it was. In the memory of England, the sweat lived on, in prayers whispered before sleep, in dreams of drowning under invisible floods, in the haunted silence of summer nights where no wind stirred and everyone waited for the first chill to come. Marsh fever, England, the Middle Ages. The marsh. For centuries it breathed beneath the land, thick, stagnant, dark. No bells rang there, no priest dared step on its damp soil. No wheat grew and no children were christened. The water stood still like a black mirror beneath rotting branches and twisted roots. Over it hung a silence so deep it paralyzed the tongue. It was there, in that silence, that the fever was born, nameless, elusive, but as deadly as the plague. The elders whispered, "The marsh hates strangers." It lived by its own rules, haunted by spirits and the remains of the long-forgotten dead. Those who wandered too far into its depths either never returned or came back, changed. The fever started with a chill, slight and barely noticeable, like the brush of a damp hand along the spine. Then came the burning heat, a bone-breaking ache, as if the body was unraveling from within. Then, delirium. The afflicted spoke in voices not their own, called out to the dead, and stared at things no one else could see. Their skin turned ashen, their eyes hollow. They carried the shadow of the bog in their gaze. The fever always rose from the lowlands, places where water gathered and never drained, where sunlight never dried the soil. Villages near such marshes saw no births, or their babies died before drawing their first breath. Farmers burned reeds and prayed to saints, but the ground refused to yield. It breathed its disease upward, and people rotted while still living. Monks called it possessed fever, for it shook the body like a demon casting out a soul. The victims couldn't speak properly, only whispered, feverish and frantic. Their bodies burned, eyes bled, muscles spasmed until the arms stretched out like crosses. Some claimed that in these fits, the voices of swamp spirits spoke through them. People vomited filth and bile and died twisted like broken marionettes. It was said that the fever struck those who had seen the Witch of the Marsh. Shepherds swore they'd glimpsed her figure amid the fog. Clothed in green tatters, her face a mask of moss, eyeless and ancient. After such visions, they would fall ill within days, never recovering. Rumors swirled like mist. In the marsh were places where the ground exhaled, and if you breathed in its breath, death followed. Worse still, the fever was not contagious. It picked its victims alone. One of 5 might die, the others remain untouched, as though the marsh demanded only one soul. Then, nothing. A decade might pass before it returned, without reason or pattern. People feared not the sickness, but its mystery. An enemy you couldn't see or understand was the most terrifying of all. There were no cures. Sufferers were wrapped in moss, drenched with well water, blessed by coin offerings, and given brews of thistle, ash, and heather. But more often than not, they were simply left to fate. Some were even abandoned in the woods, left to die away from home, so the fever wouldn't poison the household. The worst attacks came at night. Victims fell asleep feverish, then woke screaming, clawing at the walls, scratching at the floor, striking their heads. By dawn, they were dead. Eyes rolled back, tongues bitten, beds soaked through as though they had drowned in a dream. People whispered, the bog came to them while they slept. Chronicles from the time are vague and fearful. No one dared name the disease directly. It was a curse, and to name it was to summon it. In church records, one finds only euphemisms, taken by the breath of the earth, fell asleep in chill and woke no more, lost to the fog, though he lay in bed. This was a fear baked into England's bones. Fear of the land itself, of what could never be conquered. Today we call it malaria or typhus or marsh-borne fever, but back then it was a living thing. The will of the swamp, a breath from beneath the earth. And even now, though the marshes are drained and medicine has conquered 1,000 plagues, England remembers. In old songs, in misty mornings, in the hush before rain falls, the ancient fear lingers, that a single breath of the milky pallor of the skin medieval England, a sickness more feared than starless nights. It came not with a knock at the door, not with boils or screams. It did not raze villages like the plague or strike dozens at once like a fever. No, this was a different kind of terror, one that crept silently, gently, as if death itself was tired of noise. Wrong air is enough to wake the fever again. People feared it in the places where shadows were thicker than walls, where priests carried candles into the homes of the afflicted, and where the living whispered of the disease as if it could hear its name. It had many titles: milk death, the witch's kiss, ghost white skin. But more often, it was called only what it was: disappearance. It began with the skin, always the skin. It lightened unnaturally, not from hunger or lack of sun, but with a dead man's whiteness. A milky tone spread over the face, the chest, the hands, as if the blood itself were draining, abandoning the body. No freckles remained, no veins showed, no warmth, just smooth waxen cold, like candle wax left too long in moonlight. His soul's cooling, they'd say, his blood's retreating. The first to suffer were often young men, apprentices, laborers, sons of farmers. Healthy and strong, they would return home one evening pale and quiet. A day later, they'd stop speaking. By the week's end, they would lie motionless in bed, their breath shallow and strange, like the breath of something that should not be breathing at all. Some didn't die. They simply faded, not only from life, but from memory. Families stopped saying their names. Villagers averted their eyes. It was as if the sickness erased not just color, but existence. Some believed that witches stole their vitality in the night, not from blood, but from the very light of their souls. Others claimed the pale ones had seen something from the other side, and their skin had lost its anchor to the world. The milky pallor was a sign that the body had become a doorway, no longer human, no longer closed. They said the sick heard whispers at night, voices that called them from the shadows, soft and persistent. Their skin became painfully sensitive. Clothes felt like thorns, water like needles. They stopped sleeping, or they slept with eyes wide open, unblinking. Some said the pale ones could no longer see their reflection in water. One day they looked into a well and saw nothing at all. There were rare cases where the skin began to glow, faintly at first, then stronger, like a buried ember behind parchment. Those were the most feared. The glow meant they were no longer among us, not truly. Such people were driven out. No prayers helped them. No medicine touched them. They were dead in spirit, though their hearts still beat. Priests tried to pray for their souls, but the prayers fell into silence. Candles flickered out, holy water boiled, icons cracked. One monk wrote, "I prayed for him, but felt no presence, only a vast, terrible absence. He is already gone." Most terrifying of all was that the illness was not contagious. That meant it had no logic, no traceable path. It chose. Sometimes one victim a year, sometimes 3 in a month. There were no patterns, no warnings, only stillness and silence. Old folk believed there was one way to save a pale one, to pull the illness out at dawn. They would carry the person to a hilltop, sprinkle them with cold spring water, and drive a silver knife into the ground beside them. If they screamed, they still had a soul. If not, they were burned by sunset. As the centuries passed, the sickness vanished. Or, as some whisper, it simply sank deeper into our bones, our silence, our forgotten memories. Perhaps it waits. Perhaps it thrives in those who no longer recognize their own faces, in those who wake with a chill, not of weather, but of something growing inside, draining color from within. After all, the one who steals your warmth does not rush. She waits in mirrors, in quiet corners, in the part of your soul you've stopped noticing. And when your skin turns white, not pale, not sickly, but milk white, she knows you're ready. Bloody tears. When tears turned to blood, and women became witches in the eyes of their neighbors. This illness was rare, terrifying, and nearly silent. It was not like the plague or smallpox. It didn't eat away the skin or dry out the throat or shatter bones. It targeted only one part of the body, the eyes, and with them, it shattered lives. It appeared in chronicles of monasteries, in the whispers of peasants, in the black books of inquisitors. It was known by many names: Devil's Cry, Mary's Curse, Blood Without Wound, but most often it was simply called Bloody Tears. It always began without warning. A woman, usually a young widow, an unmarried girl, or a solitary figure, would wake up one morning with a light burning in her eyes. She would think dust, wind, tiredness. But when she leaned over the water to wash her face, she saw her reflection, staring back with crimson streaks below the eyes. Not wounds, not bruises, but pure, liquid blood, flowing from the tear ducts. At first, she would hide it. She would stay indoors, wrap her face, avoid the market, the church, but the village noticed. In medieval England, nothing stayed secret for long. They shared one field, one chapel, one suspicion. The whispers began fast. She cries blood. She's been touched by darkness. She gave herself to the devil. They said it was punishment for hidden sins, especially if the woman was too beautiful, too smart, too strange. A sign. God had turned his face away and the devil had claimed her. Some believed she had spent the night with a demon, an incubus disguised as a man. Children whispered that to drink a drop of her tears would make one invisible. Old women warned, if she looks into your eyes, your soul will cry too. But the worst part was that the condition did not stop. It worsened. At first, the blood tears came once a week, then every day, then constantly. The woman would wake and sleep with blood on her face. The skin beneath her eyes would swell and darken, not from bruising, but from exhaustion, shame, and pain. Her vision would blur, her head would pound, but worst of all, society would abandon her. Husbands left wives. Mothers hid their daughters. Priests refused communion. Inquisitors were never far behind. The woman would be dragged to a chapel or locked in a cellar. She would be subjected to trials, crosses pressed to the skin, holy water fasting, prayers shouted at her face. If the tears didn't stop, it was proof enough. The devil lived inside. Some died during the trial, others burned. Some were simply never seen again. A few escaped. They fled to the wilds, forests and boglands, where outcasts and supposed witches dwell. Maybe there in moonlight they found others like them. Maybe they cried blood together. Or maybe they simply vanished. Centuries later, doctors, no longer monks or torturers, but scientists, proposed a name, hemolacria, a rare condition where blood mixes with tears. They cited ruptured vessels, hormonal shifts, tumors, trauma. They explained it. They named it. But to those in the 13th or 14th century, it was not a disease. It was a curse. One monk, Brother Thomas of Canterbury, wrote of a girl named Agnes. Her bloody tears began at 17. He described her as quiet, humble, pious. But the villagers turned on her. She was cast out. Months later, he found her in a seaside cave, blind, skin pale, cheeks crusted in blood, but she still prayed. He wrote, "Her tears were blood, but her voice was light. And if this is the devil's work, then I fear I no longer know where God resides." Now centuries have passed, but even today stories emerge. A girl in Brazil, an old woman in Germany, a child in India, all said to weep blood. Scientists offer reasons, people nod, but deep down, something ancient stirs, something too primal to dismiss. For as they said in the old times, where tears turn to blood, no human belongs. Only shadows look back. The cursed mirror disease. When your reflection no longer belongs to you and fear becomes your final breath. Among all the strange and terrifying illnesses whispered about in medieval England, none haunted the mind quite like what came to be known as the cursed mirror disease. It didn't rot the flesh like leprosy, nor boil the blood like the plague. It didn't cripple the body. It shattered the mind slowly from within, like black mold growing inside the soul's foundation. This illness was not physical. It left no sores, no fevers, no coughs. It left behind only silence and mirrors that people feared to touch. It always began subtly. A person, often a woman or adolescent, would begin to glance more often at their reflection in polished metal, in water basins, in rare pieces of glass owned only by the wealthy. They would notice small, unsettling details. Their reflection blinked slightly off time. The corners of their mouth curled differently. The eyes seemed too dark. At first, they blamed it on fatigue, on grief, on imagination. But the fear grew. They began to feel watched, not from the outside, but from within the reflection itself. They would turn away from the mirror only to feel that something was still watching. They covered it, broke it, avoided their own shadow, but still felt followed. The reflection had learned to live without them. Some saw their face age overnight in the mirror. Some claimed the reflection smiled when they cried, or moved when they did not. It would blink too slowly, or not at all. Sometimes the reflection would turn away entirely, even while the real person stood still, eyes wide. In medieval villages, this was not a private madness. Word spread quickly. Those afflicted were branded mirror-touched, cursed, marked by the devil. People believed their souls had been weakened, that something dark had crept in through the glass, through vanity or sin, and taken root. Some believed the affliction came from pagan magic, from Celtic rites or Eastern rituals. Others thought it the work of witches, that a soul could be pulled into the mirror, leaving the body a hollow shell for demons to wear like clothing. Attempts were made to heal the afflicted. Holy water, fasting, days of prayer in dark rooms free from reflections. Priests would break all mirrors in a home and smear ash across any surface that held a gleam. But if the symptoms worsened, if the visions began, panic set in. People would wake up screaming, saying they had seen themselves standing in the doorway, eyes gleaming, unmoving. They described dreams in which their reflection stepped out of the mirror, climbed into their bed, and lay down in their place. And in the dream, they were left behind, trapped in the dark behind the glass. Some patients died from fear. Others took their own lives, drowning themselves in wells, throwing themselves from cliffs, setting fire to their homes, and some simply vanished. Villagers whispered, "The shadow took them back." Children were warned not to stare too long into still water. Mirrors were banned from bedrooms. Even puddles after rain became objects of dread. One of the rare written accounts comes from a healer in Somerset, early 15th century. He described a girl named Allison, who claimed her dead mother's reflection remained in the mirror and later entered her body. She refused to sleep. She destroyed dolls, saying their eyes were watching. She carved her face. Eventually, she disappeared. The only trace left was a message scratched on the wall. "I'm in the glass now." In later centuries, psychiatrists would label such conditions as Capgras syndrome or dissociative identity disorders. Scientists would speak of hallucinations, trauma, neural misfires. But in the medieval world, such explanations didn't exist. There was only one truth. If your reflection no longer follows your movements, you're no longer yourself. And when that happened, you had one choice: pray, destroy the mirror, and hope that what looked back from the glass did not step out when the candles went out. Stone skin, when the body turns to stone and the soul remains trapped within. Among the many curses that haunted the ash-covered roads and plague-crossed fields of medieval England, there was one affliction that did not boil the blood or rot the flesh, but instead transformed the body itself into something no longer human. They called it stone skin, a slow and merciless disease that began as nothing more than a rough patch of flesh, but ended with the soul imprisoned in a body that no longer moved, no longer felt, a body that no longer lived, but still existed. At first it seemed harmless, a bit of dryness on the elbows or knees, a roughness blamed on cold winds or hard labor. Shepherds blamed it on the frost, blacksmiths on the fire, midwives on sin. But the patches began to spread, darkening, thickening, losing all softness. Eyelids grew heavy, fingers became stiff and coarse, the neck lost its grace, and soon, skin across the arms became coated in a hard, bark-like shell, dry and cracking like old wood. The afflicted moved more slowly with each passing day. Their voices turned hoarse, as if their throats were stiffening too. Some began to resemble living statues, not carved by a craftsman, but shaped by agony itself. Their skin lost warmth and sensation faded. Some beat their own limbs, screaming, but felt nothing, only the dull thud of fist on stone. That's when the village began to whisper, "The stone is crawling into the veins." Soon, only the soul will remain, locked inside. Elders said it was divine punishment. Others believed it a curse from ancient gods, returning to reclaim sinners. A few whispered that the disease came from deep within the earth, a poison rising through the roots to claim the living and bind them in silence. Priests could offer no cure. Holy water burned the afflicted like acid. Prayer did nothing. The disease ignored the cross, mocked the anointing oils. Those who dared touch the sick later noticed a faint gray powder on their palms, a dust that would not wash away. Sometimes the disease spread unevenly. One eye remained bright and alive, while the other turned glassy and immobile. Half a face would twitch and weep, the other frozen like marble. It looked as though someone were half buried in death, yet still breathing. In some, the mouth sealed entirely. They could no longer speak, only breathe, weak and wheezing, as if life remained within the shell of a body. Peasants built separate huts or sheds, locking away the afflicted. They called them the stoned ones. Bread and water were left at the door, but no one dared go near. Occasionally, someone would emerge from isolation after months, covered in cracks, their eyes empty, their face unreadable, and that was enough to send people running. Some were burned, not from hatred, but out of fear that the disease lived even in walls, in dishes, in the very stone of the village itself. Scholars tried to explain. Some said it was an imbalance of humors, that cold phlegm overwhelmed warm blood, drying and hardening the body. Others blamed lead in the well water, or believed the stars sent it down when Orion rose low in the sky. But no cure was ever found. The worst part? The mind remained intact. Victims still thought, still remembered, still wept inside, but could not move, could not cry out, could not beg. They sat, lay, or stood, slowly turning into monuments of their own suffering, waiting for death to close their eyes. Sometimes, long after the body had turned stiff and gray, a finger would twitch or an eyelid flutter, just enough to remind onlookers that the soul was still inside. They said in the northern woods of Britain, there was a ring of standing stones, not ancient monuments, but those who had succumbed to stone skin. Their families carried them there as a final mercy. No one knows how many of those stones once breathed and begged silently before the cold finally claimed them. Travelers never looked into the faces of such statues, because as the old tales warned, if you stare too long into the eyes of a stone-bound soul, it may stare back. Silent rot. When flesh decays in silence and death walks slowly, step by step. In those times when the church bells tolled more often than birds sang, and skulls lay beneath every yard of dirt, a new plague began creeping across the land of England. It made no sound. It gave no warning. It did not come with fever, nor seizures, nor screams. It simply began in silence. They called it silent rot, a disease that devoured a person from within without so much as a whisper. The first signs were subtle. Teeth began to loosen, as if some unseen force was prying them from the bones. Then the tongue swelled, heavy and slow, like it had been poisoned. The afflicted could no longer speak, only issue faint, raspy moans. Slowly, the mouth became a battlefield. Ulcers, cracks, and a stench that made even dogs recoil. Their breath carried the foulness of the grave. Even then, the disease made no sound. No fever, no coughing, only stench. Only the slow, inevitable unraveling. People began avoiding those who smelled of death, even though their skin remained unblemished and their eyes remained bright. But it was already too late. The rot was inside them. In time, the gums began to bleed. The flesh in the mouth detached from bone, peeling away without pain. The tongue turned black. The victims could no longer eat, yet they did not die from starvation. They continued walking with swollen faces and silent mouths, dripping thick pinkish pus, as if death had nested in their lungs. Then came the third stage. The decay reached the throat, the neck, the chest. The body turned soft and sponge-like to the touch, like rotting meat beneath skin. Strangely, the skin remained intact, but anyone who touched the sick could feel that beneath it, the insides were liquefying. No rashes, no boils, just stench and silence. No one knew where it came from. Some said it was punishment for pride, for blasphemy, for falsehood. Others blamed witches, claiming they cursed bread and drink. A few whispered that silent rot was the spirit of the unburied dead, returned to claim the living whose corpses had not been burned or sanctified. Servants refused to touch the infected. Families locked them in stables, surrounded them with garlic and herbs, all in vain. The disease did not fear light, nor fire, nor holy water. It lived within like a worm in fruit, emerging only after death, with the final breath. Burying the victims was terrifying. Gravediggers wrapped rags around their faces, soaked them in vinegar, sealed bodies in sacks, and buried them far outside the villages. But even then, the earth resisted them. They said the corpses did not decompose because they were already half rotten before death. In the village of Epworth, one such grave was accidentally opened. The body looked almost fresh, but its innards were black and crawling with worms, and the stench was like sulfur and death. Some monks believed silent rot was the physical form of spiritual decay. When a person lost honor, faith, and mercy, their flesh began rotting while the soul still clung to life. They refused to treat such people. They only prayed for their souls while the body still breathed. There were horrors. One man lived a whole year with this disease. He spoke not a word, fed on thin broth, and began rotting from his legs up. His stench drove even his own family away. He died with eyes wide open, filled with horror, and within 3 days, his body crumbled into dust, never even growing cold. But worse than death was survival. Some lived. Their mouths were forever disfigured, their tongues black as coal, their breath a stench none could bear. They were no longer fit for human life. Villagers called them mute corpses and banished them. They said the rot had simply gone to sleep, but had never left. Amulets began to appear. Bundles of mint, copper plates, sachets of salt. People hung them over doors, wore them around their necks. But nothing helped, because silent rot did not come from the air or water. It was born from within. Moon madness. When the full moon opens the gates to madness, and man becomes a beast without fur. In the dark ages, when night was thicker than shadow and torchlight failed to pierce the gloom, whispers began to stir across England of a new affliction. It came not with fever or sores, but with moonlight. People said, "The moon drains the mind," and those who felt its cold gaze upon their faces would never return the same. The disease crept in slowly. A man could appear healthy, strong, clear-eyed, but as each night inched closer to the full moon, he began to change. First, sleeplessness. The afflicted tossed and turned, murmured in half-sleep, scratched at their chests. Their pupils dilated like those of a hunting animal, and their stares turned hollow. Then came the rage. When the moon reached its fullest, the madness took hold. People began to howl, not from pain, but from an ancient fury that tore at their insides. They clawed their own faces, slammed fists into walls until blood ran down the stone. Their bodies thrashed, strong and untamed, eyes glowing with lunar madness. It was as if something had awakened within them, something older than memory. Priests claimed the full moon was a doorway, and through it walked the devil. They spoke of an ancient spirit cast into the sky, now returning through beams of silver. This being, called the Pale Shepherd, was said to mark his chosen and drive them to frenzy. The afflicted were not cursed, the priests claimed. They were possessed. Chaining such people was often futile. They were bound with ropes, locked in cellars, tied to trees. But still, when the moon rose, the bindings broke, and reason evaporated like mist. Some never returned from this frenzy. After a night of madness, they were left shattered, unable to speak or remember their names, shells of what they once were. Children were especially vulnerable. They laughed at nothing in the night, spoke to invisible things, pointed at the moon as if greeting a friend. Some were placed in monasteries, where monks chanted psalms through the night in hopes of keeping the demon out. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the morning revealed a monk with a torn-out tongue, and the child silently watching from the shadows, blood on their cheeks. In remote villages, rituals were devised. Before the full moon, the sick were led to lakes and splashed with freezing water. A lock of hair was burned, candles lit before mirrors. It was believed this sealed the soul's reflection, blocking the demon's path. But the disease always returned, patient like the moon itself. Hunters and shepherds were frequent victims. Those who spent long hours beneath the sky claimed the moon watched them with intent. Some tried hiding in the forest during full moons. A few returned wild-eyed, filthy, with clumps of torn-out hair and bite marks on their own arms. Others were found naked, clawing at trees, with splinters jammed under their fingernails. At the height of the plague, travel was avoided on full moons. Horses refused to move near the afflicted. Dogs growled, howled, and hid under carts. Even the bravest men locked their doors, hoping the silver light would pass them by. Strangely, moon madness rarely killed. Its victims lived for years, slowly becoming feral, speaking nonsense, chewing bark and whispering to stones. Some villagers believed them to be seers, cursed with second sight, and feared them more than they pitied them. They were called the moon-marked, neither fully alive nor dead. One nobleman, desperate to save his wife, had a stone tower built without windows. Its ceiling was mirrored. He believed that if the moon's light was reflected back, it might cure her. Instead, she gouged out her eyes. leaving bloody circles on the walls, like claw marks from some beast trying to escape. Though the disease vanished with time, the fear remained. Even now, in quiet corners of the English countryside, old folks still close their shutters during a full moon, for the moon still watches, and none can say whose name it will whisper next. The Crimson Plague of Monks. When blood stirs within monastery walls, and silence becomes a sentence. This illness never crossed tavern thresholds, never visited bustling markets, nor crept along village paths. It lived in silence, within stone monastery walls, under arches echoing prayers, where men believed they were protected by God. But nothing could guard them from what bloomed inside their very flesh. The Crimson Plague, people began to call it, for those who dared to name it at all. The disease had no formal name, only dread. It began with the faintest warmth. One brother would rise before the morning bell, murmuring about tightness in the chest and tingling in his limbs. Beads of sweat would dot his forehead, and his skin would appear flushed, swollen, like something inside was pushing outward. A day later, the swelling grew. Faces puffed, lips cracked, and skin turned a deep, unnatural red, as if the body had filled with blood and was ready to burst. The disease made no noise. It grew in silence. Monks endured their suffering without cries, believing it was divine punishment. They did not beg for help. They simply knelt bare-chested in their cells, whispering prayers as blood began to leak from their ears, nostrils, and the corners of their eyes. The body ballooned like a wineskin left in the sun, and the afflicted began to gasp. They breathed like fish stranded on shore. Some went blind, others lost speech, but none complained. It was believed that complaint was a sin against God's will, and so they died in stillness, eyes wide open, staring into the heavens. Some said the plague was punishment for pride. Once humble monasteries had grown rich, hoarding illuminated manuscripts and gleaming relics, not for salvation, but power. Altars became more gilded, and hearts colder. And then came the plague, crimson as the blood of a lamb laid upon the altar. The first recorded outbreak struck the Abbey of St. Mark near York. Of 40 monks, 30 died within 4 weeks. Their cells reeked of iron and stale sweat. Rats vanished from the crypts. Even animals seemed to know that death had taken residence. Monks fought back in the only ways they knew. They anointed bodies with oil, burned incense until their chambers choked with smoke, and smeared ashes across their skin. But it was all in vain. The plague came like a spirit choosing a host, and only left when the final breath escaped. In some abbeys, self-exile became the protocol. The infected were led into the forest, placed in stone huts, and sealed inside. Food was delivered on long poles. Psalms were sung from a distance. The plague still claimed them. Even the most remote monasteries couldn't escape. It was as if the illness traveled not by touch, but by prayer. Through the very stones, soaked in faith and fear, no one knew its true origin. Some blamed foul water, others forbidden texts containing cursed knowledge. A few claimed a monk had opened an ancient tomb beneath the chapel, unleashing a sin bound in flesh. None of these theories brought comfort. Curiously, the plague struck almost exclusively men, especially monks and hermits. Lay people were rarely afflicted, as if the disease avoided sinners and targeted the pious. This terrified many, for if even sanctity was no shield, what hope remained? Monasteries locked their gates. Some boarded up their windows and refused all visitors. Eventually, they were forgotten. Come spring, villagers would find them deserted. The only remains, scrolls scattered across the floors, reddish stains on stone, clinging like memories that refused to fade. People began calling it God's wrath, Jonah's blood, or the seal of silence. But the monks never gave it a name. They simply continued praying, with crimson skin, swollen fingers, blind eyes, and died in the same silence in which they had lived. Today, few speak of the Crimson Plague, but old monasteries with their red-tinged walls stained by time and moisture still give travelers chills. For time takes much, but not all. Sometimes it leaves behind echoes of pain, etched in stone, the quiet cough of widows. When love dies and grief becomes an illness, heard only by the night. This disease was rarely mentioned in chronicles, never recorded in the official ledgers of healers or monks. Yet in rural villages, it was whispered about in the candlelit dark, passed from elder to child with wide-eyed warnings. It bore no boils, no fever, no visible contagion, and yet it claimed lives, slowly, silently, stubbornly. Among the people, it became known as the quiet cough of widows. It always began with a loss. A woman would bury her husband and go through the motions of mourning. Black veils, days of silence, prayers over icons, the scent of burning wax and rosemary. But while others returned to life, she remained in the shadows. Grief did not loosen its grip. It coiled around her lungs like ivy. And then came the cough. Soft, apologetic at first, almost ashamed to exist. A dry little sound at night, barely heard over the crackling fire. Neighbors would say, "She's still calling for him." The church labeled it a trial of faith. The woman would be told to pray harder, to walk barefoot to the chapel, but the cough remained. It became part of her, like her breath or her heartbeat. All day she might be quiet, composed, seemingly healed. But as the sun disappeared, the cough returned, like a ghost visiting only in the dark. Sometimes the cough deepened, became more violent. It shook the body. Blood appeared on her lips. Physicians tried honey, herbs, leeches, but nothing cured it. The villagers said, "It is not of the body, it's in the soul." And what is lost in the soul cannot be healed with roots or prayers. Some widows remarried, hoping to bury their sorrow under a new name, a new bed. But the cough only worsened, as if the body rebelled against betrayal. At night, they would whisper in their sleep, speak to no one. Their voices trembled with words meant for someone who no longer walked the earth. Mirrors would fog over without cause. Objects moved. Shadows lengthened. It was said that the deceased had returned, not in flesh, but in presence. Most terrifying of all, the disease seemed to count down time. Nearly always precisely 1 year after her husband's death, the woman would pass. No fever, no wound, just gone. Some died in sleep, their hands folded peacefully, a faint trace of blood on the lips. "He came for her," they would whisper. The church could not explain it. No demon, no sin, no scripture spoke of this. In desperation, some villages created strange rituals. In the south of England, a widow was taken to her husband's grave and made to shout his name 3 times, holding a burning coal in each palm. If he did not answer, she was said to be free. One woman did this. The cough stopped, but a week later, she was found lifeless in bed. The coals lay cold on her pillow, but black marks remained on the linen. The rite was never performed again. Girls grew terrified of becoming widows. Some believed that loving too deeply was a curse, a promise made to death itself. Amulets began to appear. Rings engraved on the inside with "Do not call." Veils placed over mirrors after a husband's death, so his soul would not draw the living in. But none of these defenses worked. Over the decades, the illness seemed to vanish. Perhaps grief changed shape. Perhaps women learned to bury their sorrow alongside the body. But in quiet corners of England, some still speak of it. An old widow coughing through the night. A house where soft gasps echo beyond the wall. A woman who lives exactly 1 year after her husband, then slips silently into the earth. And if, late at night, you hear a faint dry cough from an unseen room, do not knock, do not call out, just pray. Because it might not be a cough at all. It might be grief, wearing flesh like a shroud, searching for another to carry into silence. Dead breast. When motherhood turns to pain and milk becomes a poison to life. In the stillness of the village night, among the cries of newborns and the creak of beds, there emerged a sickness that no one dared name aloud. Old women whispered of it by the stove. Young mothers feared it more than death itself. It was awaited with dread, like a sentence that would never be read out. They called it dead breast. Not for blood, not for visible death, but for the cold that could no longer give warmth. The illness came suddenly. A woman would give birth, in agony, in sweat, in tears, but with hope. The infant arrived into the world alive, blindly seeking the breast. The first few days seemed normal. The child nursed. The mother smiled through exhaustion. But on the third or fourth night, something changed. The baby would begin to cry, not with hunger, but with pain. A thin, almost unnatural whimper, as if from something older than its days. Its face reddened, its tiny body writhed. It pushed away the breast, then tried again, and screamed. The mother, confused and frightened, would press the baby to her, feeling milk still flow. But it no longer flowed white, nor warm. It thickened, took on a grayish tint, sometimes even dark. Some claimed it turned black, like tar. Others reported milk streaked with blood. Still, the mothers fed their children, praying it would pass. But the infants withered. They began gasping for air. They shrieked in agony, and most often, they died. At first, people blamed the evil eye, then witches. They said a dark spirit crept into the house at night and sucked the life from the woman's breast, turning her milk to poison. Others said it was a punishment for conceiving out of wedlock or during sacred fasting days. But soon, even the wives of priests and the daughters of lords fell victim. The disease cared nothing for status, nor the church's blessing. After the death of the child, the mother often went mad. Some struck their breasts with fists, trying to wake the milk. Others fell into long silences, staring into space. But in every case, one sign remained: coldness. Not metaphorical, literal. The breast turned cold to the touch. No rubbing, no hot stones, no tinctures could warm it. The flesh lost sensation. Sometimes dark blotches appeared, sometimes a faint rotting smell. The milk stopped altogether. The body refused motherhood. The breast had died. Some women in delirium and despair cut off their own breasts. With kitchen knives, in silence, in screams, they were buried apart from the village. It was said that dead breast could be passed through the gaze. If a mother with the sickness looked too long at another's infant, that baby would begin to waste away. The church tried to intervene. Rituals were held. Priests sprinkled holy water on the breasts. The bodies of the dead infants were buried with dolls stuffed with herbs. But the death count rose. People began to believe this was not illness, but a curse, placed on mothers who never wanted the child in the first place, or on those who had once ended pregnancies in secret. Yet no theory could stop the fear. The most terrifying cases were those in which the breast died, but the mother lived. These women walked through their villages like shadows, their eyes vacant, their bodies hollowed. They never bore another child. They were not invited to christenings. They were not allowed to hold infants. They became ghosts among the living, carrying within them the memory of something cold, silent, and irrevocably gone. And when in some village, a newborn began to wail night after night, mothers would clutch their breasts in dread, because they knew if the milk suddenly turned cold, if the baby turned its head and screamed, then death had already entered the body. Not the death with a scythe, but the one that grows quietly inside, voiceless, black, and still, like the milk of a dead breast. The ringing sickness, when even silence becomes unbearable, and the sound inside the skull devours the mind. In those grim times, when prayers were louder than laughter, and the toll of the church bell more familiar than any song, there emerged a disease, not of body, but of sound. Unseen, untouchable, it slithered inside like a serpent into the sleeping ear and began to dwell, ringing, growing, destroying from within. People called it many names: hell's bells, the singing of the dead, the tolling curse, but most often, the ringing sickness. It always began innocently enough. A man or woman would complain of a faint ringing in the ears, like someone far away was calling them with a silver bell. Monks would smile and say, "An angel whispers to you." But the bell did not stop. It grew louder, more persistent. It became a chorus of chimes, a storm of sound. It howled like wind, roared like hooves across stone. Soon the sufferer could no longer hear voices, no longer distinguish music. They woke at night, weeping, clutching their skulls, begging for silence, but there was no silence. Not ever again. Some knew from the first moment that something had gone terribly wrong. They fled to churches, fell before altars, begged for exorcism. Priests would anoint them, drench them in holy water, stuff their ears with herbs, burn them with heated iron. Nothing helped. The ringing grew only stronger. It pulsed with every heartbeat. It became a part of their flesh. Others tried to escape in solitude. They plugged their ears with wax, hid in barns, buried themselves in cellars. But the sound came not from outside. It was within them. It was their own skull, their blood, their breath. And day by day it grew crueler. No longer bell, now pounding, now screaming. Some believed that those who endured the ringing too long began to hear the bells of hell, calling their soul downward. First, the ears suffered, then the mind. People began speaking to themselves, unsure if the words were theirs or the sounds. In the ringing, they heard voices, curses, moans, screams. They said their name was being called by death. Many began to shout, uncontrollably, desperately, trying to outscream the noise in their heads. Villagers chained them in barns, gagged them with cloth, tied them to trees. Still, the screaming didn't stop, nor did the sound. It was most feared among craftsmen, blacksmiths, town criers, carpenters, those whose lives were already filled with noise. They went mad faster than others. People used to whisper, "If the bell ringer stops smiling, run." One toller, they said, crushed his own skull with the clapper of the bell. Another bit a priest, saying the man was singing inside his bones. Physicians were helpless. They poured vinegar in ears, cauterized the canals, pierced eardrums. But it made no difference. The sickness was not in the ears. It was in the mind. On the rare occasion an autopsy was done, strange black veins were found lacing the brain. Some said it was decay. Others whispered, demons curled into knots. What terrified most was that the ringing worsened in silence. When the world went still, no voices, no tools, no wind, the sound within overwhelmed everything. It grew sentient. It pounded like fists, clawed at the skull. People tore at their faces, at walls, begged for noise. Any noise, just to drown the infernal ring. Some drowned themselves in wells. One man, it said, cut off both his ears and left a note. "Now I can hear God." The sickness was rare, but when it came, the whole village fell silent. It did not spread like plague. It did not travel by touch, it whispered, and none could say who would be next to hear that first faint bell. When the church bell tolled, for fire, for death, for famine, the elders would tremble and cross themselves. For a bell may sound outside, but far more terrifying is when it begins to ring inside you, the nightingale's silence. When the voice disappears and the soul remains trapped. In the dawn of the Middle Ages, when words carried power and songs could heal or curse, people feared losing their voice more than death. It wasn't just silence that terrified them. It was that silence could steal a person from the world. Thus was born the legend and terror of one of the strangest and most sinister afflictions of the time, the nightingale's silence. The illness came suddenly. One morning, a person would wake, open their mouth to greet the day, and nothing would come out. No whisper, no rasp, not even a breath. Their voice had vanished completely, as though it had been torn away along with their soul. Surprise turned to panic. The afflicted would shake their heads, pound their chests, wave their hands desperately, but their mouths would never know sound again. At first, it was believed to be divine punishment for lies, blasphemy, or gossip. Villagers remembered who spoke too freely, who mocked the church, who slandered others. These silent ones stirred fear, for their silence wasn't chosen. It was a sentence. They were called the muted, prisoners of the bird, or simply nightingales. Not for beauty, but because, as they said, some unseen bird had flown away with their voice. But the nightingale's silence was more than mere muteness. It eroded a person from within. Without a voice, one lost connection to the world, to loved ones, to oneself. The sufferer withdrew. Their eyes filled with dread. They began to wonder, did they still exist if no one could hear them speak? Some took to scribbling endlessly on walls with charcoal, writing the same desperate phrases, "I'm here, I was, I live," but even those words were met with silence. Among priests, the disease inspired superstitious horror. They said it was a sign. The soul was trapped in the body, like a bird in a cage, and could not fly free. At night, they whispered, the mute would rise from their beds and wander in the dark like ghosts, silently mouthing prayers. Their lips moved, but no sound came, only the shadow of words, like the rustling of dry leaves. A monk from Canterbury once said, "I saw my brother in prayer. His lips mouthed Ave Maria, yet not even the candle flickered. I knew then, his soul was praying without him." Some tried to force the voice to return, with potions, with pain, with spells. They poured boiling water into mouths, shoved feathers down throats to wake the bird within. Most died from the attempts. Better to be silent than to die screaming, with a scream that never reached the air. At times, the disease took a darker turn. The voiceless began to hear a voice inside. Not theirs, a stranger's. It whispered, pleaded, sang, threatened. Some went mad. One old man scratched into stone, "The voice will return, but it won't be mine." The silence often chose women, especially those with beautiful voices. Girls who sang in churches, told children stories, soothed the weeping. Suddenly, silence. Their songs vanished forever. Some claimed a jealous spirit stole their voices to compose a demonic song. Sometimes at night, people heard singing in the woods, eerie, hauntingly beautiful. Old women whispered, "Those are their stolen souls still singing." The mute became outcasts. They could not confess love, not repent their sins, not cry out in pain. Their fears remained trapped inside. Silence turned them into shadows. The worst was when children lost their voice. A small boy, his lips moving in a plea for help, but no sound. It broke hearts. Some believed a voice could be reclaimed only by sacrificing another. There were tales of someone falling mute and another suddenly speaking in the exact same tone. People stepped back in fear. "He speaks with a stolen voice. Where is his own?" The disease left as suddenly as it came, if it ever left. Sometimes after a year, sometimes after 10. More often, never. They died in silence, their final words never spoken, buried with sealed lips, as if the living feared what they might say from beyond. The nightingale's silence remains in old tales. Even today, in ancient villages, they speak of those who remain silent for too long. And if, one quiet night, you hear a beautiful voice outside your window, singing an ancient hymn, don't open it. It may not be a song. It may be a soul, still searching for its voice. The pale fever of blacksmiths, where metal melts, flesh decays. They were men of fire, Strong, soot-covered, dripping with sweat, blacksmiths were seen as the chosen ones of metal. They forged horseshoes, swords, locks, crosses. No castle, no village, no army could function without them. Their hammers were extensions of their will, their forges, sanctuaries of heat and strength. But one day, the flame they served began to answer, not with warmth, but with a terrible chill. At first, it was barely noticeable. A blacksmith in Wiltshire realized that his skin looked oddly pale each morning. Not the pale of nobility, but the hue of boiled bone, bloodless and lifeless. He blamed the fog, the long hours, but soon his fingernails darkened as if rust had taken root in his flesh. The hair at his temples fell out, and the skin on his hands began to peel like brittle parchment. This was the pale fever. It didn't manifest as fever in the usual sense, but as an inner burning out. Those who worked most with ore, especially newly imported from the East, fell ill one by one. Their skin lost color, as if the sun no longer touched them. They whispered, "It's as if the metal is pulling the light from us." In its second stage, pale blotches appeared, on the chest, beneath the arms, on the neck, barely visible but hiding sharp, searing pain. Some sufferers said their skin had thinned, as if a whisper could pierce it. Veins stood out, and the heartbeat thudded visibly beneath their eyes. Work became torture. Hands lost their grip, the hammer grew too heavy. Even the smallest nail resisted their trembling force. Some claimed the metal had begun to whisper. The hiss of flames, the clang of iron, provoked migraines and vomiting. They grew afraid of the very thing that once gave them purpose. Villagers began to murmur, "It's punishment for their pride." They forged blades for killing, nails for crucifixion. God turns his face from iron. But monks offered another theory. In the records of Lichfield Abbey, one entry reads, "Smith Martin, coated in rust, nearly transparent. His skin refracts no light. He gave his flesh to fire. Now flesh demands repayment." Others blamed the ore. The new batch came from lands where pagans worshipped dark idols forged in hidden furnaces. If such metal fell into Christian hands, it brought taint. Indeed, every infected forge had shared one particular ingot, and from it, not a single usable sword was ever crafted. Over time, the disease changed. The infected developed darkened eyes, irises fading to black, pupils stretching to the edges. They looked blind, yet seemed to see too much. They knew when someone lied. They felt fear in others. Some claimed they could predict death. Wives spoke of strange behaviors. Their husbands sat silently by cold forges, staring into the ash as if waiting for flame to rise. They no longer touched iron, rejected food served on metal plates. One wrote in charcoal on the wall, "The metal is in my blood. I am being forged from the inside." Healers were helpless. They applied mercury salves, bled the sick, placed leeches on their temples. But the fevered became more transparent by the day, fading between hammer and anvil, losing flesh, voice, weight. The final stage was the most horrifying. The skin peeled from their palms, and beneath, no muscle, no bone, only a smooth, metallic sheen. People whispered that the smiths were turning into iron. A shepherd swore he saw one punch stone and leave a dent. In another village, a wife found her husband dead, his body heavier than a hammer, and even the gravedigger's spade couldn't pierce the earth. It was said the ground refused him. The disease vanished over time, like smoke from a dying flame. But in old forges, if the bellows are stirred and the fire lit, a faint tapping can be heard. Not from the outside, but from within the metal, as if something inside still calls. Thus was remembered the pale fever, the curse of those who fed the fire until the fire fed on them. The whispering pox. When the skin speaks, the soul falls silent, an old saying from Northumberland. In the northernmost corners of England, where villages lay hidden among swamps and tangled forests, a strange disease took hold. At first, it appeared like any ordinary case of smallpox: fever, weakness, and the usual eruptions of blisters across the body. But soon, healers and priests alike understood this was no ordinary pox. This illness did not simply ravage the flesh. It invaded the mind and disrupted the very essence of human speech. The earliest cases seemed bizarre but unrelated. A boy began speaking in the voice of an old man, hoarse and dry, as if a century of dust had filled his lungs. A girl who had just learned to babble suddenly spoke fluently, in Old English, a tongue long dead to living ears. Others found their voices changing entirely. Women developed raspy, masculine tones. Grown men began to babble like infants, their eyes wide with terror. But the most horrifying phase was the one whispered about in fear, the whispering stage. The pustules that covered the victim's skin, especially the face and chest, began to murmur. At first, the sounds were faint, mistaken for wind or fevered delirium. But then, several monks recorded in trembling script that they could clearly make out words. "Don't sleep. He's coming. I was here before. You will become me." It was believed that it was not the infected who spoke, but the disease itself. The murmurs did not match the movements of the patient's mouth. Sometimes the voices continued even after death, especially if the body had not been buried before sundown. In Lancashire, peasants told of corpses whose pox-scarred bodies shuddered in their coffins, and from beneath the nailed lids, a faint voice could be heard whispering, "It's cold. Let me out." Superstition bloomed like rot in a grave. People began to believe the disease could be transmitted through hearing alone, that simply listening too long to the afflicted could make pustules bloom on your own skin. Conversations ceased. Victims were sealed in chapels, locked in lofts, or even thrown into dry wells. One blacksmith nailed himself inside his barn, whispering that his hands had begun talking to each other. Monks attempted exorcisms. They recited psalms, poured holy water on the skin of the infected. But the water boiled on contact, and the pustules shrieked, not from pain, but as if something inside the skin cried out in rage. More disturbing still, some pustules formed patterns, circles, spirals, arcane symbols that no one could identify. One physician in York claimed to see a phrase emerge on a man's chest: "I am you. You are me." Some patients survived, but many lost their voices forever, not from damage or fear, but as if the voice had been erased. One such man, a monk named Benedict, wrote in charcoal, "I no longer hear God's voice, only silence, and it is louder than hell." Others simply vanished. Some walked into forests and never returned. Infants who survived grew up with taut, waxy skin and never spoke a word. One child was said to whisper his mother's dreams, even while asleep. Over time, the disease faded, like smoke from a blown-out candle. But in some remote parishes, people still forbid whispering indoors, especially at night. And if a child breaks out in rash and speaks in a voice not their own, they are taken to the old women of the woods, who know the rites to bind the tongue of the pox. The whispering pox became more than just a skin affliction. It became a voice buried in bone, a murmur behind the teeth. And if you ever hear your own skin call your name in a whisper, do not answer. It already knows who you are. The beast skin of the shepherds. He who watches the sheep too long becomes a beast himself. Old saying from the hills of Cumbria. In the mist-wrapped highlands of medieval England, where human footsteps were rare and wolf howls echoed across the moors, the shepherds lived alone. Silent, rugged people, more attuned to the rhythms of nature than the towns they fed. For generations, they tended their flocks far from churches and markets, beneath skies heavy with rain or snow, in places where roads dissolved into wildness. And it was among them that a strange affliction, feared, unspoken, began to take hold. It started subtly, not with fever or rash, but with a thickening of the skin, a coarseness, as if the flesh itself was remembering a more primal form. Hair grew darker and denser across their arms, their chests, their backs. Over weeks, it hardened into something closer to fur. Their eyes shifted hue, amber, yellow, wild. Their nails darkened like claws. And soon, the villagers whispered, they were no longer entirely human. At first, the afflicted were seen as odd, touched by isolation or perhaps too much wind. But then, stories began to spread. A man named Thomas from Penrith returned to his wife after 3 months alone in the hills. He no longer spoke. He slept not in his bed, but curled in the hay beside the livestock. He refused broth and bread, gnawed instead on raw meat, and growled when approached. His wife swore that his eyes glowed in the dark, and his palms had grown rough, like the pads of a hound's feet. These were not isolated cases. Across the Highlands, in Cumbria, Northumbria, and the borderlands, shepherds were transforming. Not quickly, not entirely, but undeniably. They moved with a low gait, their heads held strangely forward. They no longer seemed to feel cold, even in the snowstorms. One was seen lying motionless in the frost for hours, as if waiting for prey. Their speech faded. Some stopped speaking altogether, communicating with grunts or growls, or not at all. Locals called it the beast skin. Others whispered darker names, the wolf's cloak, God's rejection, or nature's vengeance. Superstition grew. Priests refused to enter the shepherds' homes. Children were kept inside after dusk. Wives wept at night, whispering prayers for their husbands who came down from the hills, only to sit silently by the fire, teeth bared, shivering not from cold, but from something else. What caused it? Some blamed witchcraft, that lonely shepherds had bargained with forest spirits. Others believed it to be punishment, for overgrazing, for disturbing ancient burial mounds, for trespassing on sacred woods. The learned men had no answers, no cure, only fear. Monks recorded terrible signs, crosses etched into their chests, not carved by blade, but formed by hair and skin. One body exhumed from a northern chapel had deep claw marks inside the coffin lid. Another was said to have howled during the burial, the voice echoing through the earth. Not all who caught the beast skin perished, but none returned as they were. Some survivors lived as outcasts, avoided even by kin. Others fled into the forests and never returned. Children born to these afflicted men sometimes bore unusual traits: elongated limbs, pointed teeth, patches of hair at birth. One such child never spoke a word, but was found sleepwalking in the night, standing naked in the rain, staring into the woods. The disease, or curse, seemed bound not by blood or touch, but by solitude. Only those who had spent too long with beasts, too far from hearth and prayer, were taken by it. As though nature, slow and patient, was reclaiming what man had borrowed. To this day, in the remote dales and uplands of England, some shepherds hang iron charms on their crooks and leave offerings at the edge of the forest, milk, salt, or bread, in quiet reverence, just in case. And if, on a lonely moor, you hear something howl that sounds almost human, pray it's only a wolf, because some beasts remember being men. Witch's cold fever. When even fire can't save you, it means winter has settled inside. Entry from a village herbalist's journal, Yorkshire, 1457. In the winter of 1456, strange things began happening in the English village of Longdale. It started with a farmer named Gregory, whose hands began to tremble. He said he couldn't get warm, even though he sat right by the hearth, wrapped in 3 wool cloaks. His family laughed, until they noticed his lips had turned blue and his hands were cold as ice. The next morning he was dead, not from heat or wound, but from a cold that seemed to eat him from within. A week later, 2 women and a boy met the same fate. They shivered, moaned, and clung to fireplaces, but nothing helped. They froze in above-freezing weather, and one woman, they said, boiled water and poured it over herself, trying to feel warmth. Her body was found blistered, her face contorted in a frozen grimace. So was born the village legend of the witch's cold fever. This illness didn't begin with sneezing or bleeding sores. It didn't crawl across the skin. It entered the body quietly, like a shadowy demon nesting in the heart. First came a faint chill, then an endless, inescapable cold that no fire could relieve. People wrapped themselves in furs, lay beside hot irons, drank boiling wine, but the trembling only worsened. Weakness followed. The tongue grew sluggish. Breathing slowed, like fog on a winter's night. Skin paled, nails turned black-blue. The victim froze, to death, even in a warm room. But the most terrifying part was how it began. One witness claimed he saw a woman in black, barefoot, her eyes like frost, walking past his home. Soon after, the fever struck inside. It was believed the witch didn't curse people directly. She touched their soul, leaving a shard of winter inside. That shard grew silently, and when a person's heart turned to ice, they died. People started accusing neighbors. In Longdale, they burned an old woman named Edretha, rumored to never feel the cold. In Cambria, they named a widow a witch because her home always felt chilly. Across England, from Somerset to Durham, people called the disease winter's touch, ice in the blood, or the frost spirit. Even the learned men of the time couldn't explain it. Monks in Bury St. Edmunds described bodies with abnormally low temperatures, as if life had fled, leaving frozen shells behind. Some thought it was leprosy, others a rare form of plague. But no herbs, no tonics, no prayers could save the afflicted. The most tragic tale was of a young girl named Jane from Dorset. She fell ill after dreaming of an icy woman calling her to a lake. Jane raved about snow falling inside her, and her bones hurting from wind. Before her death, she left a note. "Mother, I'm burning from the cold." Physicians noted that the disease wasn't contagious. It didn't spread like the flu. It couldn't be caught. It seemed to drift in on the wind or appear when someone had lost all hope.